I was born into a world of angles and lines, a world where shapes mattered more than words, where a sheet of paper filled with graphite blueprints felt like scripture to me, where the hum of machines and the clang of steel beams created a lullaby no parent ever sang, and from the earliest days I believed that buildings were not lifeless objects but living monuments, reflections of the people who designed them and the people who walked within them. So I threw myself into study, into perfection, into geometry and mathematics until the language of architecture was carved into my very blood, and by the time I was 30 I was known as a visionary, the one who could turn concrete into poetry, the one who could make glass shimmer like captured fire. The one they invited into boardrooms not because I wore their tailored power but because they needed the brilliance of my designs to crown their empires. They called me Selene Ward, architect of tomorrow, but what they never understood was that I did not build for their greed, I built for beauty, I built for Daniel, the man who saw me not as an ornament of intellect but as a soul worth loving, the man who steadied my trembling hands when deadlines crushed me, who cooked for me when I forgot to eat, who kissed me with a gentleness that contradicted his towering frame, who whispered that no matter what I built or how high the towers reached, his heart would always be my truest home, and perhaps that was my fatal flaw, to believe that beauty and love could survive in a world run by men who measure worth in profit margins and blood hidden behind polished contracts. The halo was supposed to be my salvation, the crown jewel of the skyline, a skyscraper that would curve like a ring of light around the sky, mirrored panels designed to bend the sun into radiant streams so that even on the darkest mornings the city would remember warmth, and I poured everything I had into it, every sleepless night, every calculation, every whispered prayer that when people looked up at it they would feel awe instead of despair. But from the beginning the men funding it, those faceless titans in silk ties, whispered of cost-cutting, of imported materials that cost a fraction but cracked under pressure, of inspectors who could be silenced with envelopes slipped into briefcases. And when I fought back they smiled like wolves and reminded me that contracts could bury me just as easily as steel beams. And though Daniel urged me to keep fighting to stand tall, I felt the ground shifting, the foundations of my dream trembling before the tower even touched the clouds. On the morning of the unveiling the air buzzed with champagne and applause, the mayor stood ready with his silver scissors, journalists crowded with their flashing lenses. The investors smirked like kings about to unveil a new throne, and I stood at the base of the halo with Daniel's hand gripping mine, whispering that it would all be worth it, that beauty could outshine corruption, that my vision would rise above the rot. But even as he spoke a heaviness gnawed at my chest, a silence in the steel that did not feel like pride but warning. And then he let go of my hand to step inside for the last time to retrieve the plans I had forgotten. A small thing, an innocent thing, and I will never forgive myself for not stopping him in that instant. Because then the sound came, low at first, like a groan pulled from the earth itself, a vibration that rattled my bones, and then it sharpened into a shriek, the shriek of steel tearing, of bolts shearing, of glass veins splitting into spiderweb fractures that raced across the mirrored skin of the tower, and I screamed Daniel's name but my voice drowned in the roar. Drowned in the thunder of collapse as the halo folded into itself like a dying star, one floor collapsing into the next, explosions of dust and glass tearing through the street as hundreds of bodies disappeared into the avalanche of my dream turned nightmare, and for one suspended second I saw him, a silhouette framed in shards of falling light, and then he was gone, swallowed by the ruin I had created. The ruin they had forced but I was destined to bear. And as I choked on the dust, as the city wailed in horror, as sirens split the horizon, I knew something inside me had broken beyond repair. The days after blurred into interrogations, my name carved into headlines dripping with poison, microphones thrust into my face while flashes blinded me, reporters calling me murderer, calling me careless, demanding tears for the cameras while I was drowning in an ocean of them behind closed doors. And though I tried to scream of sabotage, of weakened steel, of lies written into contracts, no one listened, no one cared, because villains sell papers, because scapegoats absolve the guilty, and I became the perfect monster in their story. They dragged me through courts where lawyers with manicured nails painted me as arrogant, reckless, obsessed with beauty over safety, while the men who cut costs sat silent in the back watching with crocodile calm, knowing the world would never touch them. And the judges, bound by strings of power I could not see, hammered down verdicts that shredded my career, my credibility, my very humanity. And when they were finished with me, when the cameras had drained every ounce of humiliation, I was left in silence, no home, no husband, no future, only the endless echo of falling steel inside my skull. I disappeared then, slipped through the cracks of the city like a shadow. And the world believed I had taken my own life, that Selene Ward had drowned herself in grief, and perhaps in truth she had, for the woman who once built towers of light was buried with Daniel in the rubble of the halo. But death is not always an ending, sometimes it is a foundation, and as I wandered forgotten alleys, as I slept in abandoned buildings where the rain sang against broken windows, as I studied the fractures of glass beneath my fingers, I began to see patterns in destruction, to trace beauty in collapse, to sketch not monuments but traps, not skylines but vengeance, and in the silence of my exile I whispered to the shadows that one day I would return, not as Selene Ward but as something else, something sharper, something that could cut as glass cuts, something that would haunt them the way they haunted me. They never noticed when the whispers began, when survivors of accidents claimed to see a veiled woman in the reflections of cracked glass, when rumors of a widow cloaked in shadow spread across workers and night guards, when spiderweb fractures appeared at sites of unexplained failures, as if the city itself had begun to curse the powerful men who walked too carelessly. But I knew what was being born. I knew that the name they would give me was not an insult, but a prophecy, and as I stared at my reflection in a broken pane, hair tangled, eyes hollow yet burning, I whispered it for the first time, the glass widow, and I knew that from the ruins of their lies I would design a new architecture, one made not of steel and concrete but of vengeance, precise, patient, unbreakable. And though the city believed I had fallen, though the world believed I was gone, I was still here, waiting, planning, and the men who thought they had buried me would one day look into a window and see my shadow staring back, reminding them that glass never forgets where it cracked, and neither do I. When I vanished, the world thought grief had killed me, but in truth grief had reforged me, sculpting something sharper than sorrow, something patient as steel cooling in the dark. And as I wandered the forgotten skeletons of half-built towers, I began to learn that destruction too has a design, that collapse leaves behind a blueprint if you know how to trace it. And with every shard of glass that sliced my hands I felt closer to Daniel, as if his voice whispered from the cracks themselves, telling me to rise, telling me not to let their lies stand unchallenged. And so I began to map my vengeance the way I once mapped my dreams, with pencils, with rulers, with notebooks filled not with elegant facades but with diagrams of failure, of how weight could shift, how tension could break, how the smallest flaw introduced at the right point could bring down giants. And when the city looked away, when the news grew tired of my name, I stepped out of the shadows, not as Selene Ward the disgraced architect, but as the figure their greed had built, veiled, silent, inevitable, the glass widow. The first one was a man named Harrington, a safety inspector who had smiled in my face during the trial while swearing under oath that the beams had met every regulation, who had cashed envelopes fat with blood money while hundreds suffocated under rubble, and I followed him through the city like a ghost, studying the places he felt safest, until I found him in his glass-walled office, perched high above the streets in a tower I had not built but could read like scripture. And I spent weeks marking every flaw, every overlooked crack in the tempered panes, every bolt left to rust. And then one storm-drenched night I arranged the smallest of nudges, a pressure point manipulated so that as he leaned against his pristine window to smoke his victory cigar, the entire pane fractured outward in 1,000 glittering shards, and witnesses swore later they saw a spiderweb pattern form just before it burst. Swore they glimpsed a veiled reflection in the glass as Harrington plummeted screaming into the street, his blood painting the sidewalk like a signature. And though the police called it a tragic accident, those who knew whispered of something else, of the widow returned from the grave to claim her due. But vengeance is not satisfied with one offering, and soon the hunger drove me onward, to Keller, the lawyer who had shredded my testimony until jurors saw arrogance instead of truth, who had mocked Daniel's death as an unfortunate footnote, who lived in a penthouse lined with skylights that stretched above his marble floors. And I crept into his sanctum with hands steady as a draftsman, altering the supports in subtle ways, so that when he hosted a gathering of his peers, boasting of his victories, the glass overhead shuddered under its own tension until it cascaded downward in a rain of razor-edged daggers. And though the survivors wailed of curses and fate, I knew it was no accident. For I left behind what I always left, a single sheet of glass etched with a spiderweb fracture, placed neatly on his desk, gleaming in the candlelight as his blood seeped into the cracks, my calling card, my message that every structure has a weakness, and so does every man. The city began to whisper then, at first in hushed voices, then in headlines, though no one dared print my name, for how can you name a ghost, how can you catch a reflection? And so they christened me by rumor, by legend, the glass widow, the veiled figure seen in shards before disaster struck, the curse of those who had profited from the halo, and though the police scrambled, calling them coincidences, the people knew better. Because patterns cannot hide forever, and every fracture I left was part of a larger design, a mosaic of vengeance unfolding one pane at a time. The investors who had once smirked at my protests began to look over their shoulders, began to flinch at their own reflections in boardroom windows, began to request bulletproof glass and reinforced walls, but glass remembers, glass betrays, and I knew their fortresses would not save them. For I had studied every one of their monuments, every flaw they had ignored in their rush to profit, and I would turn their own arrogance into the seeds of their collapse. Weeks turned to months, and each strike became more elaborate, more precise, as though I were conducting a symphony of destruction, and in the silence of abandoned draftsman tables I would sketch not towers of light but towers of death, my pencil carving lines of inevitability. And I no longer saw myself as human in those moments but as an extension of the city itself, its rage embodied in my hands, its grief whispered through my breath. And yet within the fury there remained sorrow, a hollow ache each time glass shattered, because vengeance is never pure, it is stained with longing, with the ghost of Daniel's touch that I could never reclaim. And though my enemies fell, though their screams echoed like music, each death reminded me that I was alone, that justice had become the only architecture I could build, and that my own soul was as fractured as the glass I left behind. Rumors spread that I could walk through reflections, that I was not a woman but a phantom born of grief, that if you stared too long into a cracked mirror you might see my veil staring back. And though the myths grew wild, I let them grow, for fear is a stronger foundation than truth, and fear was the scaffolding upon which I was building my legend. The police formed task forces, detectives obsessed over blueprints, experts argued on television whether accidents were truly accidents. But none of them understood that accidents are only accidents until someone shows you the lines of design, and I had become the master of unseen design, the widow who did not need bullets or blades but only patience, precision, and the cold language of architecture. By the time the third executive fell, his limousine crushed under a collapsing glass canopy at a luxury hotel he himself had cut costs to erect, the city no longer dared dismiss me as myth. And though the authorities still tried, the public had already written my gospel in whispers and stares, and everywhere I walked unseen I felt the city shifting, bending, becoming part of my revenge. And yet beneath the triumph I knew the blueprint was incomplete, because the ones I had taken so far were only pieces of the puzzle, only the outer walls of a fortress whose heart still pulsed with power. And I swore that no matter how many lines I had to draw, no matter how much blood had to drip between the cracks, I would reach the center, I would find the true architects of my ruin, and when I did, the city itself would collapse upon them. The final blueprint was never meant to be admired, it was meant to unmake, and in the months after the halo collapsed I learned to read a city the way I had once read blueprints, to find where weight pooled and neglect had gnawed away safety, to see the thin places where arrogance met structure, and where a tiny introduced fault could ripple outward and topple a life that thought itself untouchable. And so I drew not a monument but a map of failure, tracing seams beneath plazas and conduits, beneath transit hubs. And I planned not to collapse a single building but to expose the connective tissue that allowed the council to hide their contracts and sign away children's futures, because killing one mask only ever reveals there are more masks behind it. My plan needed a long breath, not a sprint, because architecture answers to time and habits and the invisible choreography of people, and I was patient enough to exploit that choreography. Patient enough to watch how the council traveled and which routes they favored, which hotels they preferred, and which charities they used to launder both money and reputation. And I did not recruit armies because people leak, I built leverage into the city itself, using maintenance rotations and service shafts, the forgotten tongue of rivets and fasteners, tiny changes to tolerances and microfrequencies and foundation ties that no inspector would notice because inspectors read reports with rubber eyes while a city hums with its own secrets. And I seeded spiderweb fractures carefully as signatures, not threats but notes to those who had ears for architecture, so that when the collapse came it would not have the taste of accident but the grammar of design. On the night I chose for the nexus to be revealed, their gala shimmered under a canopy of engineered glass that had been installed to impress donors and hide the shortcuts, and it failed not with thunder but with that slow dreadful bloom of fracture that a designer can see before a crowd can. And as panes split into lacy shards the faces of the powerful showed in refracted light as if 1,000 mirrors had finally told the truth. And the footage that caught their panic moved faster than any PR machine could spin, because spectacle alters memory in a way paperwork never can, and for the first time the council's veneer was stripped and left raw in public view. They scrambled mercenaries and legal teams and messaging desks, but spectacle rearranges context, and the avalanche of images and names forced inquiries that couldn't be quietly folded back into envelopes. And yet I did not stand and shout with triumph because no spectacle could bring Daniel back, and each fracture reminded me that my work was a ledger of absence. An attempt to convert grief into a form of civic accountability that could not be reburied by money alone. The counterforce answered like an old machine learning model trained on patience, and their reply was not bullets but bureaucracy and mimicry. A watermark in logs, metadata strings tucked into leaked files that spelled a message simple and lethal in the code I had taught myself to write and use. You are known, and the thought of custody meant they could watch me in the grain of my movements and prepare containment strategies that used process to strangle action. So I moved not only to break structure but to unwrite their ability to keep secrets in archives and behind polished titles. I followed the thread like I followed beams and ledgers, and it led me to archivists who curated truth as if it were a currency, men whose vocation was to preserve evidence and who had learned to turn it into leverage. And in a disused observatory I met one such curator, who spoke of a council convened to manage the messy problem of truth long before my halo fell. A calculus that traded visibility for stability and decided which testimonies could be let loose and which would be archived and sealed, and their language was coldly efficient dressed as civility, and they offered me an exchange as obscene as it was simple: join and steer truth for your convenience, or be catalogued as another instance of ruin. I spat at that offer because being given a hand in the system is still complicit surrender, and instead I burned the observatory, not to cower in triumph but to deny them a repository, to break their curated collections and scatter the film and ledgers I could carry into public networks that citizen journalists and watchdogs would stitch back into public memory. And as the dome smoked and the embers translated into shards of evidence across forums, for a flaring second I felt the exhilarating possibility that a ledger could be distributed and thus harder to burn. Their response was more savage than I had predicted, for power can operate by law as easily as by muscle, and they deployed smear campaigns, legal harassment, men with licenses to detain, and they also left mocking white feathers at scenes as signatures of arrival force, a mirror that indicated an apparatus to absorb movements like mine and incorporate them into the archive. And I understood with a cold clarity that I had not only attacked structures but touched a system that rewrote accountability as a function of who curated its records. The white feathers were a threat and a confession, but they also told me something crucial. If they could mirror my symbols, they had studied my work, and if they studied my work, then I was being measured, test by test, to see what an agent like me could break, and their patience meant they could weight me into mistakes. So I shifted tactics, moving from spectacle to scaffolding, building networks rather than bombs, fostering survivors into witnesses with legal protection, feeding funds through anonymous trusts, training safe drivers, and creating stashes for evidence that no one paper trail could easily erase. Because a ledger alone may be burned, but repeatable testimony becomes a kind of living archive that resists singular destruction. We built in slabs and spans of humility and cunning, and grassroots groups grew teeth as evidence spread into pockets of civic outrage that could not be purchased back into silence. But the war took a price. The informants who helped us corroborate shards sometimes disappeared in white vans, and some safe houses were compromised, and the losses etched fresh fractures into me that not even the act of exposing a registrar could soothe. In one vault beneath a deconsecrated church I found an iron trunk of names, a ledger titled The Benefactors, inked in hands that thought them safe beneath the weight of sanctity. And when I released that ledger into the public net through code that splintered it into shards across channels, the shards were gathered and amplified by citizen journalists and small collectives, and for a fevered hour the city felt like it might right itself, with governors calling inquiries and families demanding answers, and the council's machines stuttered under the public gaze. Yet every victory birthed a ripple, and the archivists adapted deploying process and ritual, turning inquiries into inquiries about method and timing so that litigation and bureaucracy smothered momentum. And they left the white feathers like trophies to show they both had watched and still controlled the narrative arc, and their scale meant that even when a man resigned there were offices and safe accounts prepared to ensure the work of secrecy continued. I learned that winning required more than exposures. It required making the public memory durable enough to resist smoothing by lawyers. And so I cultivated channels where survivors' voices would be heard again and again, where testimony was rehearsed and corroborated, where the ledger's shards could be reassembled by people who refused to be silenced, and in that way I turned ephemeral spectacle into an infrastructure of reckoning that could not be undone by a single archivist's erasure. They attacked with legal arms and hired hunters who tracked movement and signals, and my margin for error narrowed. And one night when the net closed and I found an invitation in a maintenance hatch in the subway, a simple time and address scrawled in a hand that smelled of antiseptic and cigarette smoke, and though part of me knew it could be a trap, some other part wanted to know who had the audacity to mock me with a white feather and to call my design well made, and I went to the appointment because understanding who watched me was part of surviving. The address led me to a suspended observatory where an archivist sat like a curator of ruins, and he spoke not with the rage I expected but with the soft inevitability of one who had seen empires cycle, and he made the old offer again, that truth is dangerous and we manage it so that histories do not collapse cities, and that I could be co-opted into their governance if I desired mercy rather than martyrdom. I burned the observatory after taking a brittle recording from him, a file that contained the salted conversations between officials about moving people between jurisdictions, and I scattered the evidence across networks that would not be easily scrubbed, and the flames lit the sky like a confession that confirmed to some citizens that the archives they trusted had been used as tools, and that knowledge fueled new watchdog groups and watchdog platforms that refused to be gate-kept by the same old institutions. Their retaliation escalated, not only with agents and suits but with subtle infiltration, with white feathers tucked into evidence envelopes and with tales in the press that painted me as unhinged and reckless, and longer-running operations tried to co-opt public sympathies away from us by running narratives about safety and the rule of law that only the council could supply. And in that media chorus names were recast and the ledger's shock dulled by instruction and procedure. So I diversified, building legal funds hidden in anonymous trusts to protect witnesses and training safe houses and setting up signal scramblers behind public art. And I embedded my networks in ordinary things, in the rhythms of garbage collection and the timing of trains, so that even if a house was compromised, the next safe house sat 3 blocks away under a different name, and those measures saved lives and turned fragile testimonies into durable accounts. Victory proved to be attrition rather than a single night, and though the council's power was cleaved in ways it would feel for generations, with frozen accounts thawed and a handful of indictments finally filed, the white feathers multiplied as if to remind me that the archive was not dead but reorganizing, and that the hands that archived would always find new libraries to hide in. I vanished afterward, as I had when the halo fell, leaving fractures and stories and a city permanently altered in posture from complacency to suspicion. And in the quiet of exile I realized my work had changed from pure vengeance to stewardship, because once you have torn apart the mechanisms of secrecy you cannot simply walk away and leave the seams open, otherwise entropy fills a void and the system rebuilds itself in darker corners. Sometimes I walk to the edge of glass bridges and trace a finger along the cold arc and watch my reflection fracture into spiderweb lines, and in those moments I whisper the promise I made over Daniel's grave, because promises are the architecture of memory, and memory is the only structure that secures future safety, and so I keep building not towers of light but networks of protection, little frameworks that help a child be heard when their voice is smothered, because in the end the city is not made of glass and steel alone but of the people who walk through it and the stories they carry. I leave signatures now, sometimes by choice and sometimes as necessity, black fractures on a facade or a careful note tucked into a ledger. And the white feathers still appear in the corners like an answer I have yet to understand, and perhaps one day I will learn who wields them and why they mirror my hand, but until then I hold to a sharper truth: destroying an edifice does not remake the world unless you also teach the people how to hold one another and how to make the ledger public and durable, and that work is the long quiet architecture of survivors. I am not a saint, and I am not simply a monster for what I have done. And if the city remembers me as a ghost or a curse, I will take that as a small consolation, because names are vessels and they must hold more than fear, they must hold the impulse to change, and if by my fracture the city learns to look differently at its glass, then my work endures beyond any headline. The war to own truth continues, because men will always try to hide what profited them, but we have broken a groove they relied on. And sometimes you win not by ending a system but by making it feel exposed for so long that the inertia of its secrecy collapses beneath the steady pressure of shared memory, and in that slow dismantling there is room for children to grow without being catalogued as collateral. I trace the spiderweb in my sleep and sometimes wake with glass dust on my lips, and though the white feathers haunt me, I know the ledger we made together is a map others can read now and follow to rescue or to reckoning. And for that small seed I will keep walking the edges of windows and bridges and alleys, leaving fractures that become lessons for those who follow.